A false confession is when a person admits guilt to a criminal offence for which they are not actually responsible for. Until fairly recently, it was presumed that nobody would ever confess to a crime they didn't commit. It was simply impossible. This assumption also meant that until recently, a confession was viewed as irrefutable evidence of the person's guilt. However, it is now acknowledged that people do falsely confess, and that a confession should never be taken at face value. In the United States, a confession that had been coerced during an interrogation was frequently allowed into court as evidence until a prominent Supreme Court decision in 1936, known as Brown v. Mississippi. When a white man was killed in Kemp County, Mississippi in 1934, police quickly arrested and charged 3 local black farmers with his murder. During their interrogations, the men were subjected to brutal physical torture, including being whipped repeatedly, and were told the beatings would not end until they confessed. After eventually confessing to the murder, they were later found guilty at trial, despite the prosecution having just the confessions as evidence. Only once the appeal was reviewed by the Supreme Court were the 3 confessions acknowledged as illegitimate, and the Supreme Court justices established that using that as evidence at trial violated their right to due process. Research has highlighted many other reasons, apart from avoiding physical pain or punishment, that may make someone falsely confess, including promises of leniency, intoxication, exhaustion, both physically and mentally, a belief that they will be released after confessing, mental illness and a skewed perception of reality, and finally, notoriety or attention. False confessions may in fact be more common than you think. According to the Innocence Project, roughly 1 in 4 people who were wrongly convicted and later exonerated through DNA evidence had made a false confession or incriminating statement. There are 3 main types of false confession. The first is known as a voluntary false confession. This is when an innocent person confesses because either they believe they are guilty, which is often due to mental illnesses such as schizophrenia. Their confession is sacrificial and helps avoid somebody else being prosecuted, or simply because they are hoping to gain attention or notoriety from confessing. The last reason often happens with high-profile missing persons or murder investigations, where people come forward and confess to either gain media attention or to disrupt the police investigation. The next type of false confession is known as a coerced, internalized confession. This occurs when a person is convinced by the police, at least temporarily, that they are in fact responsible for the crime. This type of false confession is often linked to the suspect having a fragile memory of the event in question, caused by either intoxication or head injuries, and the person relies on the police to fill in the gaps in their memory, eventually believing what they have been told. The final type is called a coerced compliant confession. This is when the person makes a confession even though they know they are innocent. This is often the result of a lengthy and persistent interrogation, where the person has been pressured into believing that confessing will help them to escape from the situation and avoid more stress. Although the reasons why a false confession occurs is unique to the individual and situation, researchers have found out a common pattern that can happen. The process is often thought to begin with the misclassification error. At the beginning of any investigation, police must find out which suspect they should focus their attention on, ideally with forensic evidence or witness statements to help guide them. However, this is not always the case, and police have been known to suffer from tunnel vision as well as confirmation bias, which could lead them to target an innocent person. There are a few reasons why the misclassification of an innocent person into a prime suspect occurs, including public and media pressure to solve the case quickly, the existence of a disliked target, the subconscious conversion of the legal process into a game of winners and losers, where prosecutors lose sight of their goal to deliver justice and instead focus solely on securing a conviction, and noble corruption within the force, where police believe it's justifiable to bend the rules or fabricate evidence in order to secure a conviction. The next step in the process of a false confession is the coercion error, which is often split into two subcategories. The first of which is the modern psychological interrogation techniques currently used in places such as North America. Research points to overzealous police, poor training, and negligence as the principal causes of false confessions. Police who are trained in interrogation methods are often told by their trainers and the authors of interrogation manuals that modern psychological interrogation practices do not lead innocent people to confess, and that an innocent person would be immune to their tactics, despite empirical evidence showing otherwise. The popular interrogation method known as the Reid technique permits police to lie to the suspect, often about witness statements or DNA evidence that implicates them in the crime being investigated. This is one of the more controversial elements to this interrogation method, because certain suspects might more easily believe that someone is setting them up, or that the police have planted evidence on them. The second subcategory of the coercion error involves the psychological vulnerabilities of the person being questioned. Certain individuals may be at a higher risk of giving a false confession. This includes those with diminished cognitive functioning, such as low IQ or poor memory capacity, those with mental disorders like learning disabilities, personality disorders, and mental illness, particular personality traits like suggestibility and compliance, and abnormal mental states including anxiety, depression, post-traumatic stress disorder, drug or alcohol intoxication or withdrawal. Interrogators should be aware if their suspect falls under any of these categories and adjust their technique accordingly. However, this does not always happen. Reviews have shown that adolescents and those with developmental issues are the most likely to falsely confess. This is because these groups tend to lack the psychological resources that are needed to withstand a lengthy interrogation, but also because they are typically more suggestible and compliant, particularly to figures of authority. The final known contributor to false confessions is known as the contamination error, and often occurs once the suspect has already made an incriminating statement. The interrogators work with the suspect to help develop a coherent and compelling story to make the confession more believable. However, this is when the confession can be contaminated by the input of the officers. The difference between this contributing factor and the others is that it can be easier to detect if the contamination error has occurred. Videotaping the interrogation in its entirety is an efficient way to prove that the confession was not embellished using information from police. Over in Canada, the police are able to use covert investigative procedures as a way of eliciting a confession from suspects, as long as it takes place in a non-custodial setting. The most notorious of which is referred to as the Mr. Big technique, and is often reserved to target those suspected of committing high-profile crimes and who have been uncooperative with the police investigation. The technique essentially involves undercover police officers posing as members of a fictional crime syndicate who approach their target and provide them with jobs or tasks to complete on behalf of the criminal organisation. Once the undercover officers have gained the target's trust, and vice versa, an offer is made to help them out with their legal troubles and clear them of any police suspicion. The 7 most common offers used in the Mr. Big technique are offering the help of corrupt police contacts who are on the organisation's payroll, introducing a fall guy to take the blame, producing false documentation, claiming to be able to destroy incriminating evidence, offering to fabricate an alibi, offering the help of an expert to help the target pass a polygraph or lie detector test, and offering to frame somebody else for the crime. The only thing that is required from the target in return for this help is a full and honest account of their involvement in the alleged crime, which is where a confession may occur. However, the The validity and reliability of a confession obtained in this manner is widely debated. The targets of Mr. Big stings are often from poor socio-economic and disadvantaged backgrounds, where many of these individuals lack meaningful social ties. When they are presented with the chance to join or work with a close-knit criminal organisation, like the Mr. Big technique offers, the target could be less likely to be sceptical or cautious as to why they have been approached. Forensic psychologists have argued that the offers made in an operation like this can take advantage of those from poor backgrounds, as the suspect's economic status can increase the likelihood of them offering false information in exchange for financial help. Research also shows that people are more likely to comply with a demand if it is given by someone who they believe has authority. To the target, Mr. Big represents a powerful leader of the fictional crime syndicate, so when the target is asked to do something by Mr. Big, they are more likely to comply with their requests. Also, the relationships that are formed during these operations can become very meaningful to the target, which can make them unlikely to want to jeopardize these and more likely to do whatever is necessary to maintain the relationships they value, even if that means giving false or misleading information. Researchers have suggested that the likelihood of eliciting a false confession could be much greater in a non-custodial setting, as the suspect may not fully understand the life-changing consequences of confessing to a serious crime. Modern-day interrogation methods often create an environment where a suspect's decisions and behaviour are no longer based on objective or realistic consequences. But during a Mr. Big operation, the casual nature of the setting and conversation can further remove the target from the serious reality of confessing. Also, the Mr. Big scenario can be seen as unfairly depriving people of their constitutional right to remain silent. From the target's perspective, they are merely discussing criminal activity with fellow criminals and therefore would not be aware that their statements could be used against them. A formal interrogation at least offers the individual the chance to be reminded of their right to remain silent before any discussions take place. One of the most poignant Mr. Big operations involved a man named Nelson Hart. He lived in Gander, Newfoundland, with his wife, Jennifer, and their 3-year-old twin daughters, Karen and Krista. Although the family had experienced severe financial problems and had found themselves homeless in the past, things had improved since they began receiving social assistance and had regular visits from a social worker. On the 4th of August 2002, Nelson Hart took his daughters to Gander Lake for a day of fun. Hart returned home in a panic a few hours later and said that his daughter Krista had fallen in the lake. When the Royal Canadian Mounted Police arrived at the lake, they found Krista alive but unconscious, and Karen, who was already dead. They had both drowned. Krista was transported to hospital but was removed from life support the following day. When Hart was initially interviewed about what happened, he told police that they had simply fallen in the lake, and being unable to swim himself, he thought the best idea would be to get in his car and drive to get help. He later changed his statement to say that he had had an epileptic seizure and wasn't able to remember exactly what happened to the girls. The police were struggling to make any progress with the case, and so in February 2005, they set up a Mr. Big operation that would end up costing over 400,000 Canadian dollars. Over the course of 4 months, undercover agents befriended Nelson and paid him very well for doing odd jobs on behalf of the organisation. In a secretly recorded meeting with Mr. Big himself, he was asked about the deaths of his daughters, and Nelson eventually confessed, telling him, quote, "I drowned my daughters." On June 13, 2005, he was formally charged with first-degree murder. During his trial, his lawyer claimed that he was extremely intimidated by the implicit threats of violence that had been made by the undercover officers, and had only confessed as a way to impress the members of the organisation and to ensure his safety. The jury were allowed to watch the covert video recordings of his confessions and ultimately found him guilty. Nelson Hart's lawyers appealed the verdict, claiming that the videotaped confession was inadmissible as evidence. Their appeal went all the way to the Canadian Supreme Court, who took an in-depth look at how Mr. Big operations work and the confessions that they produce. The Canadian Supreme Court ruled that a Mr. Big-induced confession should initially be regarded as inadmissible, with the potential for this to change if the reliability has been corroborated by confirmatory evidence. For Nelson Hart, this meant that the recordings of his confession would no longer be admissible as evidence, and as a result, prosecutors decided not to retry him for murder, as without the confession, they had no convincing evidence whatsoever. This Supreme Court ruling established a new approach for assessing the admissibility of Mr. Big confessions in future, and acknowledged for the first time that the operation can actually generate false confessions. When assessing the reliability of a confession, there are many factors that are now considered, including the length of the operation, the nature and extent of the inducements offered, whether any threats were made, and the relationship between the undercover officers and the accused. The assessment also includes the importance of establishing either the presence or absence of markers of reliability within the confession, including the level of detail contained in the confession, whether it leads to the discovery of additional evidence, and whether it identifies any holdback evidence or elements of the crime that had not been made public. By merely acknowledging that the Mr. Big technique can result in false confessions, Canada has made a step in the right direction. In other countries, organisations like the Innocence Project are working hard to free those who have been imprisoned after falsely confessing during an interrogation. However, as long as there are intense interrogations and Mr. Big operations taking place, the risk of generating a false confession will remain the same, and innocent people will continue to be imprisoned for crimes they did not commit.